Well, thank you, Nurit. It's great to be with you. And congratulations to the Combat Anti-Semitism movement, to the Jewish Agency for Israel for this important conference. And I want to say, most of all, thank you, Albania. Thank you, Albania, for everything you've done and for everything you continue to do to make our world a better place. 8 decades ago, Albania was a world moral leader during humanity's darkest hours. And today, 8 decades later, still Albania is an example for the world in terms of tolerance and mutual respect and affection between ethnic and faith communities. But it's more than just tolerance. Like the United States, Albania doesn't simply tolerate its Jewish community, it embraces and treasures its Jewish community. And so I want to thank you, Albania, Prime Minister Rama, Speaker Rucci, thank you for your leadership. Not only in Albania, but of course now in your critical role as chair in office of the OSCE. And I was privileged to come to Tirana in February and participate in your amazing conference, leading the OSCE to fight anti-Semitism. Nurit, you're exactly right. I come from a heritage where we lived among Arabs and among Muslims for millennia. And there were great periods in the Arab and Muslim world for Jews, periods really of philo-Semitism, the kind of philo-Semitism that Albania represents today. But sadly, and more recently, there were periods of horrendous anti-Semitism. My mother was a young girl when she saw her father be arrested for no reason other than being a Jew. He was dragged away and thrown in prison. And the rest of my family fled Iraq, and they fled across the border to another philo-Semitic at the time Muslim country, Iran, under the Shah, which was helping Jews escape. And so in these examples, Nurit, we really see two different stories, not only of the Middle East and the Muslim world, but two different stories really of the world. A story of hatred and anti-Semitism, and a story of philo-Semitism and tolerance. And thank God, a conference like this, with leaders like Prime Minister Rama and Speaker Rucci, the example that Albania provides and the other Balkan leaders, we've heard from their leaders, really is the role model that paves the way to the kind of world we all want to see and that we all want to build.
Well, Elan, I want to go ahead and turn it over to some viewer questions because a lot of people wrote to us wanting to ask you something. So let's hear first from Avi in New York.
I am Avi Weinrib in New York, and my question is, approaches to fighting anti-Semitism seem to vary by region. What are the obstacles keeping anti-Semitism from being uniformly addressed globally?
Well, thank you, Avi. You know, it has to be globally addressed, and there really isn't anything keeping it from being globally addressed other than a lack of coordination. One of the incredibly important contributions of the Combat Anti-Semitism movement is to provide that kind of inter-organizational cooperation. And I'll say something else about regional anti-Semitism. You know, every region, every country might have different flavors and different combination of threats. Sometimes the far right is a more pressing threat. Sometimes the far left is the greatest threat to the Jewish people in a particular region. Sometimes militant Islam is the greatest threat. Certainly the chief state sponsor of anti-Semitism in the world today is the Islamic Republic of Iran. But if you look at it globally, all three forces operate sometimes operate together to propagate this sickness of Jew hatred around the world. And I want to say this: not only are these three ideological camps coming together in their hatred of Jews, but also they're joined together in their tactics, because they've all three adopted the powerful technologies of our day, the internet and social media, to give them unprecedented reach and to propagate their hateful ideologies immediately at the speed of a click throughout the world. And that's why anti-Semitism has been rising for over a decade now. I'm proud to say that the Department of State last week broadcast the first ever United States government-sponsored conference addressing and focused on online anti-Semitism, anti-Semitism on the internet and social media, because that's the big unifier here. All of these hateful ideologies are using these powerful new technologies to spread their hate around the world. And so we have to confront it, Avi. Like you said, we have to confront it globally in a coordinated, consolidated global effort.
Well, Elan, I want to take that a step further. It's certainly a global effort, a global problem. But also, I want to talk to you about the United States in particular, where anti-Semitism is also on the rise. You mentioned that State Department step, a really important one. What else are you doing, your office, to combat anti-Semitism at home?
Well, first of all, we press and focus on physical safety because, if a person isn't safe, can't leave the home and know they're protected, or put their kids on a school bus and know the kids are safe, you can't live that way. And so working with our allies to ensure that Jewish communities around the world are safe and protected is job one. The IRA definition, as an Army officer, I know that you can't really confront a threat effectively unless you first define the threat. Well, we have the greatest tool ever to define that threat. It's been adopted by more and more countries. It's the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism. The OSCE, that Albania now leads so very well, voted 56-1 to adopt the IRA definition. So you can't get less controversial than a 56-1 vote. I want to thank and congratulate Albania for being the first Muslim majority country to adopt IRA by formal parliamentary action. Of course, other Balkan countries have. Kosovo adopted it through executive action. President Trump last December in an executive order adopted the IRA definition for the entire federal government of the United States. And I'm proud to say that just a few days ago, I concluded and executed an agreement with the Kingdom of Bahrain's King Hamad Global Center that not only pledges to combat anti-Semitism throughout the Middle East and throughout the world, but adopts IRA and uses the IRA definition, the first Arab entity to employ the IRA definition to define anti-Semitism. So physical safety, the IRA definition, condemning anti-Semitic movements, focusing on the internet like I talked about before, and then, as we said before, education, education, education. If you really want to combat this scourge of anti-Semitism, we have to educate it. Speaker Osmani said it so well. We've got to educate all of the world's children, not only about anti-Semitism and its threats, but also about the beauty and the history of the Jewish people and the contributions that the Jewish people have brought to the world. I call it an education in philo-Semitism, not only an education about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism. If we do all of that, those are key initiatives for the State Department, for the United States. And if we can do all of that together, I have no doubt that we can roll back this scourge of rising anti-Semitism.
An important note of optimism, and certainly it has been quite a few months in terms of Israel-Gulf relations and the Gulf's willingness also to confront anti-Semitism. Let's go ahead and bring in one more question for you. This one from Boston.
Hello. My name is Daniel West Cohen, and I'm calling in from Brookline, Massachusetts. My question is this. Diplomacy is a key area in the fight against global anti-Semitism. In your opinion, what can diplomatic leaders realistically achieve in addressing anti-Semitism from a legal framework, and what is the role of grassroots activists in supporting their initiatives? Thank you very much.
Great question, Daniel. I think they're both critical. Look, as America's lead diplomat for the fight against anti-Semitism, diplomacy is a large part of what I do, and it is critically important for the United States to go on the record and say that not only are we dedicated to stamping out anti-Semitism everywhere in the world, but there are specific measures we need to see enacted, like the protection of Jewish communities, like the adoption of IRA, like the appointment of special envoys and coordinators to fight anti-Semitism, and all of these other measures that are so important, condemning anti-Semitic movements. And so diplomacy is very, very important to create that coordinated global focus that Avi asked about before. How do you get coordination? Well, diplomacy, one of the most important things about diplomacy is coordination, right? Diplomats can't tell other sovereign countries what to do. Countries decide what they want to do, but we can coordinate a global effort in response to a global crisis. But also grassroots activism is vital. Just look at this great conference organized not only diplomatically by Albania, but organized by a grassroots movement, the Combat Anti-Semitism movement. And with regard specifically to anti-Semitism on the internet and social media, grassroots activism is vital. And the reason why it's vital is because certainly in the United States, even hateful speech is protected by the First Amendment. It's protected from censorship, it's protected from punishment, but it's not protected from being countered and from being condemned. And so here's where grassroots activists can do what governments can't by coming together, coordinating our efforts, and condemning and fighting and countering the deluge of online hate that we're seeing sweep across the world, all the more so today in the era of COVID when so much human activity has moved online. And so we've got to do it together, diplomacy on one hand, grassroots activism on another. And if we do that together, again, I am optimistic that we'll roll this back.
Well, Elan, you mentioned it at the beginning of our conversation. We are, of course, amid the Balkan Forum against anti-Semitism. So if we're looking at that region in particular, what might your message be to those nations? What would the United States like to see happen next?
Well, my dear friend, Chairman Herzog said it so well. The Balkans are emerging as leaders in this fight. I mean, truly leaders. Kosovo, first Muslim majority country to adopt IRA in any fashion. Now Albania, the first country to do so by Muslim majority country to do so by parliamentary action. The long tradition of philo-Semitism, we heard, how moving was that to hear about Tirana and Sarajevo competing for being the Jerusalem, right, of the Balkans. It is an incredibly moving thing to see, again, not just tolerance, but far beyond tolerance, true philo-Semitism on the march, thanks to the great leaders we have in the Balkans. And so the message really is that we need more of the same. And we've got to carry this message around the world that the way to combat anti-Semitism is to be bold and to be aggressive and to say, not only don't we tolerate it, but here's what we're going to do to counter it. We're going to drive philo-Semitic narratives. We're going to fight to protect Jews. We're going to adopt the IRA definition. We're going to condemn anti-Semitism, and we're going to do it together. Let me tell you, the Balkans really have become a model for the world. And Albania certainly is really, like I said, a moral leader. And we're so grateful. Especially now that Albania is leading the 57-country OSCE, we're so grateful for Albania's great leadership. And I know that with this kind of emphasis coming from the Balkans, our future is bright.